Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 13 of our reading of Pandora's Genes. It is part of a trilogy. The second book being Pandora's Children, and the third being Pandora's Promise. And you can find this book still in the major bookstores. I found mine at a thrift store, but there are many, many places, even the library, where you can get your own copy. Anyway, Pandora's Genes is a book by Kathryn Lance, and I have the author's permission to read this book on my channel. Now, we are going to go over the copyright information first. And as here it says right here, cover art is by, really good cover art, by the way, by Dave Mattingly. All rights reserved, and it's copyright 1985 by Kathryn Lance. It's the first edition printing. And it is from the Quasar science fiction. Wait, I can't read that. Let me get a closer look here. Or something like that. Anyways, we are okay. In the last episode, it's been a week since I recorded, so it's going to be difficult for me to remember. So I might actually lapse back to maybe a previous episode or part, but let's see. Traders, Traders, not Traitors. Traders, the new religious cult, attacked the garden, and they did lose some of the women there. They died, but they've managed to fight them off. Then the principal and his army showed up, and it was decided that they should move closer to the capital. And the principal has a plan that he can manipulate the science, and steal their secrets. He has very ill intent, especially for underage kids, which is kind of really disgusting. And so Evie doesn't realize this, and she's kind of in a compromising situation now and getting drunk. He's getting her drunk, and I was kind of dreading to read this one because I know something bad is probably going to happen, but we're gonna have to find out. Anyways, let's get this party on the road, or let's get this party started. No, that doesn't sound right. Let's just continue where we left off, and I don't remember where we left off, but we'll find out. Okay, she accepted the cup, too shy to even say thank you, and sipped it and spit it out. It was horribly bitter. The principal and his friend laughed. "Bit strong," said the principal, "but you'll soon get used to it. You must never sip brew, but drink it down, like this." Draining his own cup, he demonstrated, then held it out to be refilled from the large flask Daniel carried. Evie tried again, taking a larger mouthful and forcing herself to swallow. It tasted no better, but felt warm and strangely pleasant. She could feel the path the liquid took down her throat and into her stomach. She paused a moment and had another swallow. "Better?" he asked again. She nodded. "Are you enjoying the party?" She nodded yes. "I'm glad you're having a good time, and I'm glad your sisters are too. I wanted the women of the garden to know that I respect them. It's because of that I have to move you." Evie nodded again. She had understood this in his speech. She took another sip of brew while he again drained his cup. He had drunk more already than she had ever seen Marson drink, but he seemed steady. Only his speech was beginning to slur. "More brew," he said, holding his cup to Daniel. "And for Evie." She shook her head quickly, but he didn't seem to notice. Daniel returned to the other side of the fire to refill the flask. The principal sat rather heavily at Evie's side. He began to sing along to one of the songs, and for just a moment his voice sounded like Zach's. Startled, she looked at him, and he looked back, not quite focusing. "Do you like music?" he asked. She nodded, wishing that he would continue to sing and not question her. "I haven't sung for a long time," he said. "Not since, well, never mind." He was silent a moment, gazing at the fire. "It wasn't an easy thing to decide," he said. Then, for a moment, Evie didn't know what he was talking about, then realized that he meant the decision to evacuate the garden. Without waiting for an answer, he went on. There are pressures on a leader that other people can't understand. Terrible pressures. I suppose there are, Evie said, beginning to feel uncomfortable. The principal's aide had returned, and both men continued to drink. The principal turned again to Evie. You've hardly said a word to me, yet I feel that I know you, but I would remember if I had met you before. Did you ever have that feeling about someone? Evie nodded. She had been thinking the same thing about the principal himself. The cup of brew had made her very sleepy. She yawned, then got to her feet. Don't go yet, he said. He reached for her wrist, but stopped before touching her. Please, he repeated. The way he said it made her think that he must be very lonely. I must, she said. Thank you for the party. Before you go, tell me one thing. She waited. Where are you from? I know you didn't grow up here. Evie started. How did he know that? Did he suspect the truth? She could think of no answer and stammered. She's a sensible girl, said Daniel, laughing. She's afraid of you. Don't be frightened, said the principal. I won't hurt you. I only want to get to know you. You are very lovely. Do you know that? His face was still gentle and friendly, but his voice had acquired a frightening gruffness. She continued to stand there, afraid to say more or to leave. She had begun to like him in spite of everything, but now she remembered that he owed her under the law. That he owned her under the law. If only Zach were here, she thought suddenly, and then she heard Kathy's clear voice cut through the singing. It's bedtime for all women of the garden, she called. The mistress orders everyone inside. Evie straightened, relieved. She looked down at the principal, and was startled by the look he was sending in Kathy's direction. Its intense hatred made Evie's stomach turn over. The remaining women were stumbling to their feet and moving toward the gate. The principal looked up and smiled tiredly. It's been nice talking to you, Evie, he said. I hope we can do it again. Thank you, she said. She was not sure whether she dared to be so close to him again. He started to rise and stumbled, then laughed. He was, she could see, very drunk. If he was anything like Marson, he probably wouldn't even remember the conversation. As she followed Katha and the remaining women through the gate, Evie looked back. The soldiers were dispersing. Those who hadn't simply fallen asleep by the fire. Were dispersing those who hadn't simply fallen asleep by the fire. Only a very few very drunk men were still singing. Among them were the principal and Daniel. The principal poured more brew from the flask, spilling it on his boots and raising his cup in a toast. Despite the festivity of the gesture, Evie thought that he was the lonesomest, saddest man she had ever met. Chapter 10. The trek to the northeast would take several weeks. The weather held, but the number of men and women and supplies was vast. Often streams must be followed several miles off route to find shallow spots for fording. Each night, elaborate camps had to be set up and then struck in the morning, as they had at the garden. The principal's men set up camp near, but strictly away from the women's camp. Evie was traveling with the mistress in a large covered wagon pulled by mounts and containing most of the garden's carefully packed and hidden scientific instruments. Microscopes, glass tubes, and sliders, tiny sharp knives for drawing blood. Evie continued to study as they moved and found that her facilities for reading and understanding increased as quickly as her fascination with the things she was learning. The mistress insisted that Evie spend more time on mathematics, but that did not interest her so much as history, and particularly the history of science as it had been before the change. She read about the Belgian monk Mendel and his experiments with beans, and about Darwin and his journey to the Galapagos. Quickly all that she had heard in the initiation rite became clear and real to her. No longer was DNA rampaging, invisible creatures, the wild Dinas, but rather a part of the normal genetic makeup of all living beings. Until the change, pairings of plants or animals always yielded predictable results. However, the experimental genetic material that had escaped during the change behaved like viruses, entering the cells of plants and animals, becoming a part of their living genetic mechanism and changing them in ways that could not be predicted. Evie learned that these changed creatures called mutations, mutations, were still being created, although not at so rapidly a rate. And just after the change, she talked with Hilda about the problem of growing new grain, which was wildly mutant and unstable, because most natural wild grain stocks had been allowed to die out in the time before the change. It was difficult to create with crosses hardy, disease-resistant plants that would breed true. The possibilities for scientific work seemed limitless, and Evie was scarcely waiting to arrive at the new garden and begin. She thought she might try to mate baby and raise tame fox cats, crossing them for empathetic ability, or perhaps she would be allowed to work on the project to combat the women's sickness. Without further argument, Evie redoubled her efforts at learning mathematics and was suddenly grateful for this long journey, which gave her the leisure to read and learn for hours each day. Because the caravan was so large and because she was so busy with her studies, Evie did not see the principal again until they had been on the road for nearly 2 weeks. She was sitting in the mistress's wagon, looking out at the twilight, sleepy and full from a good meal of new rabbit stew. There was a knocking on the wooden side of the wagon, and the principal stuck his head inside. "Hello, is the mistress in?" Evie gasped, startled. His pale face seemed to float in the darkness. He squinted, trying to see inside the wagon. Evie wriggled farther back among the crates and barrels and murmured, "She isn't here now. She's gone to witness a birth." "Who's there?" He frowned slightly, then smiled in a sunny, wholehearted way. "It's Evie, isn't it? I haven't seen you in quite a while. Don't be shy. Come out and talk to me." Evie crawled towards the front of the wagon and sat as far from him as she could. "Don't be afraid," he said. He lit a pipe of new smoke and leaned against the wagon, gazed at the fire. Just as at the party, Evie couldn't think of anything to say and wondered if he expected her to speak. After a moment, he spoke conversationally, as if they had been talking all day. "I know that most of my subjects are afraid of me, and it's right, they should be. A leader should be strong enough to command respect and obedience." Evie thought a moment, remembering her recent reading, and asked, "How did you get to be the principal?" He turned from the fire and looked at her. "That's a long, long story. I'll tell you about it sometime." "Were you elected?" He laughed. No elections wouldn't work in the sort of world we have today, I'm afraid. Have you been studying history then?" She nodded, embarrassed. She felt hopelessly ignorant. "Then you must know that the most important force in all society is its laws. Without laws, humans cannot live together, and without a strong authority to enforce those laws, they might as well not exist. Who makes the laws? In the district, I do. I base them on the ideas that worked in the past and seeing what works in the present. That's the whole point, to make things work. Do you obey your own laws?" He laughed again without humor. "I think you've been listening to tales about me. Yes, I do obey the laws, perhaps more strictly than anyone." "Then why," she began, then stopped. "Then why?" "Then what? Oh, why what? Go on." "You can ask me. Pretend that I'm not the principal for a moment." He smiled at her again, his face relaxed and boyish. She couldn't help smiling back. "Well," he said, when she still hadn't spoken. "Why are the laws so harsh?" she finally said. "These are harsh times," said the principal. "You're thinking of the beating I gave one of my men yesterday, aren't you?" Evie nodded. It had been just after breakfast. The women were pulling up their tents and packing their possessions on mounts and in wagons when the morning silence had suddenly been shattered by a heart-stopping scream, followed by another. Then silence, and all had stopped work and looked at one another in fear. After a moment, Katha had strode into the center of the women's camp and announced with disgust that the principal was punishing one of his men for disobedience. Remembering the anguish of that scream, Evie again felt a chill. "The man had done something which could endanger all of us," the principal said. "The night before he had gotten drunk and fell asleep on guard duty. He wasn't the only guard, but the job was his responsibility, and he didn't do it. The only way I can make the people understand how important laws are is to deal severely with those who break them. I wish that weren't so, but it seems it's been the problem of civilization ever since the world began. I'm sorry it had to happen, he added, and Evie believed him. Couldn't you just have taken away his pay? That would not be visible enough. The idea was not so much to make him suffer as to make sure the other men saw him suffer, so they would think twice before doing such a thing. But there was no harm done. That's true. This time, listen to me. I'm responsible for keeping all of you safe. As my guard, that man is an extension of me. I must be able to trust him as I would myself. Those who betray a trust are dealt with more harshly than those who are just ignorant. He spoke with such intensity that Evie held her breath. No wonder Zach had hesitated to cross this man. She wondered what the principal would have done to Zach if he had learned of Zach's betrayal. Do you understand what I've been telling you? The principal asked. I suppose so, said Evie, but so many of your laws seem unfair. Which laws? I'm sorry, I think I've said enough. Remember, I invited you to speak. What sort of leader would I be if I refused to listen to my people? Evie knew from her teachings in history that a great many leaders in the past had indeed refused to listen to their subjects. In some way, she was finding it as easy now to talk to the principal as to the mistress or to Lucky, so she went on. Why do you take such heavy taxes? I wish I didn't have to, but there is limited wealth. I must pay the men who work for me, that is, who work for the people of the district. I pay the men who build roads, who patrol remote areas, and fight outlaws. I pay the men in my army and the judges. I must also pay for supplies and food to support all these men. But your tax men take so much. My second father had to give up all his metal and nearly half his grain 3 years ago. That's wrong, said the principal suddenly. No citizen should have to pay so much. Where was this? It was. Evie suddenly stopped, realizing how much she had nearly given away. His voice was cold with anger, and he went on. They must have been keeping some for themselves. Do you know the men's names? Can you describe them? No, said Evie quickly. I was living with my grandfather then. I didn't see anyone. I just heard about it. Perhaps your father exaggerated. I remember we nearly starved that winter. I thought you said that you were living with your grandmother. The principal's eyes suddenly narrowed as he looked at her closely. Where are you from, Evie? He knew Evie was certain that he knew, but she had to answer. From near the garden, she said. She added quickly, I came to the garden because my father couldn't afford to feed us all. Why didn't you stay with your grandfather? He died, she said. It was difficult to keep lying, and Evie was afraid her voice would begin shaking. How did you hear about the garden? From my second father. He used to trade with them. What does your second father do? He's a trapper. I would like to speak with him. Have my men speak to him. I must find out who those taxmen are. He was looking directly at her. Evie knew that if she met his eyes, she would blurt the truth. All was now lost. The principal knew who she was. He would claim her and take her away from the garden. Worst of all, he would find out about Zach's betrayal. Her eyes filled with tears. After all this time, Zach's sacrifice had been for nothing. And then she had an inspiration. Turning to the principal, no longer trying to fight the tears back, she said, He's dead. Who's dead? My second father. Outlaws killed him. They killed everyone. I buried him and my brothers and then ran away. The principal scrutinized her. She held her breath, praying that he would believe her. He frowned and was about to speak again when the mistress approached, leaning heavily on a cane. She looked tired and pleased. Dory has had her baby, she said. It was her third girl. Neither Evie nor the principal answered, and the old woman looked puzzled. Well, her third girl? The principal turned to her and spoke heartily though his face was grim. That's a real accomplishment, old woman. Congratulations. We're still not sure, she trailed off, suddenly realizing how strained the mood was. What are you doing here? She asked him in a scolding tone. I need to speak to you. I've been whiling away the time with your friend Evie. The mistress gave him a sharp look, then turned to Evie. Go in and sleep, child. I have business with the principal. Yes, ma'am, said Evie. She felt the principal's eyes on her as she crept into the wagon. After a moment, she peered through the slit in the side paneling. The principal and the old woman had moved over by the fire where they sat. While they busied themselves dipping herb tea from the steaming pot, Evie slipped out the front of the wagon and circled to behind the tree where the two were sitting. She held very still and began to listen. I'm leaving the caravan tomorrow to return to the capital, the principal was telling the mistress. General Daniel will be in charge. I've told him that he must discuss any major decisions with you. Katha is mayor of the garden, said the mistress. I'm aware of that, but as far as I'm concerned, you are the leader and always will be. Katha is a stubborn fool, he went on before she could comment. I'll visit when you have reached the site of the new garden. I hope to learn more about your work now that you will be nearby. The mistress added, I or any of my scientists will tell you what you want to know. They sipped their tea. Then the principal said almost sadly, I miss it sometimes. You decided long ago that your destiny is elsewhere, said the mistress. Yes, I suppose my life couldn't have been otherwise with the training I had, he said. Don't think I'm not aware of that, or not grateful for all I learned in the garden. You have become a good leader, Will. Thank you, he said. Evie was astonished as she watched, holding her breath. It was evidently a moment of deep emotion for both. She could not even guess at what it meant. The principal squeezed the old woman's frail hand for a moment, then awkwardly let it go and turned to watch the fire. The flames illuminated both faces, and Evie realized how much they both reminded her of Zach. The old woman's light coloring and blue eyes, the principal's sharp cheekbones and thin lips. Though he was a much smaller man, the resemblance was striking when you looked at it. Sadly, Evie realized that she should have known before that the principal was Zach's brother, and the principal was Zach's brother, the mistress's other son, who had gone away 20 years ago and never came back. Feeling ashamed of herself for intruding on their privacy, Evie began to work her way back to the wagon. Then the principal spoke again. Tell me something, he said casually. The girl, Evie. Where is she from? Evie stopped. Why do you want to know? Curiosity, I suppose. She doesn't seem to be from this area. She's from near the capital, said the old woman. Her fathers heard of us and brought her when they could no longer afford to keep her. Evie's stomach turned over. Her lie had been found out. The principal continued in the same tone. Are you sure of that? Yes, I am. Now I've satisfied your curiosity, and that's that. You've satisfied nothing, he said. You're lying. The mistress pulled her arms to her chest. It's no concern of yours where she came from, she said. It may be much more my concern than you can guess at, he said. And then his voice turned harsh. Unless you already know, he paused and went on. I intend to find out the truth, old woman. Stay away from her, said the mistress, her voice as harsh as his. You cannot have her, you cannot have her ever, not without risking everything. We will never let you take her. Do you understand? Suppose she comes to me willingly. The old woman smiled and looked straight at him. That will never happen, she said. Evie has become a daughter of the garden. The principal spat and abruptly stood. You've won for now, old woman. I have urgent business and little time to think of the girl, but I tell you this. I have an idea who she is, and if I'm right, nothing on this earth, not the garden and all its daughters, will keep me from her. He rose, then bowed in a sarcastic way. Good night. I will see you at the new garden. He strode rapidly away towards the men's camp. Evie, her heart pounding furiously, scampered back to the wagon as quickly as she could. For many hours she lay with her eyes open, listening to the sounds of the night. Over and over she saw the principal's face, smiling openly, then contorted with rage. She heard his voice, his breath, his laugh. The images were so intense that she felt as if he were not in the men's camp, but here, in the wagon beside her. Part 3. The Garden. Chapter 1. Most of the leaves had fallen, forming a thick crisp carpet on the forest floor. The air was chilled and invigorating, and the principal had to conspicuously guard against pushing his mount too fast. He was impatient and curious, wondering why he had suddenly been summoned to the new garden. He had not visited since the women had moved in 2 years ago, although he had been in frequent communication with them by writing. He had found excuses to avoid any contact, and besides, in truth, he had been busier these 2 years than ever before in his rule. The capital was now a thriving city, and he could no longer oversee the administration of all basic services. This meant training others to do the work for him. He had also started a school for teachers and healers, overseeing and, in some cases, creating the curricula himself. Even more time-consuming had been the constant training of new troops, some to man the increasingly important outlying fortresses, including the old garden, others for police duty in the capital, where they were charged with keeping order and arresting the growing number of traitor proselytizers. He had also traveled a good bit in these 2 years. He had journeyed to the sparsely populated, bat-ridden Northlands, where he reaffirmed his uneasy truth with the governor of the North, an educated old man of little vision, who ran a feudal-like system, and who welcomed the principal as an ally against the traders, who had begun to move into the North too. Afterwards, for several months, he had led an expensive and fruitless expedition of exploration into the unmapped areas of the West where the traders were believed to originate. Finding nothing, but ignorant, unkempt nomadic tribes, many of whom followed the new religion of organized structure of religious leaders, there had been no trace, though the primitive people his troops encountered seemed to be more resistant to the idea of civilization than even the people of the district had when he had first assumed control. The movement seemed to have sprung up everywhere at once like mushrooms after a rain, with no order or direction. We're going to have to stop that here, and we will continue. We are making good progress, it looks like. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you when I upload. We have been reading from Pandora's Genes by Kathryn Lance. She has other books in this trilogy: Pandora's Children, which is the second book of the trilogy, and Pandora's Promise, which is the third book. And I'm sure these are still for sale in most of the major book outlets. These have been reprinted several times, I believe. Anyways, thanks for watching, everyone. Oh, if you want to support me in any way, all the information will be in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.